Trump's administration made it crystal clear: every tool in America's arsenal is on the table when it comes to stopping narcotics from poisoning our streets and holding traffickers accountable. So when the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group went dark and slipped south of Puerto Rico at 20-30 hours, pushing over 18 knots through Caribbean waters with deck lights killed and radar emissions dialed down, most observers figured it was just another routine deployment. Wrong. What actually materialized was the heaviest concentration of U.S. naval firepower in Latin American waters since the Soviet Union was still a thing worth worrying about. Along Venezuela's coastline, that massive silhouette registered on ancient radar installations like a punch to the gut. Coastal monitoring stations running obsolete equipment caught a bloated return signature roughly 90 miles north of La Guaira. But here's where it gets good. Their aging JY-11B system, notorious for terrible target resolution beyond medium range, completely botched the read. Instead of identifying a full carrier battle group bristling with Aegis destroyers and enough ordnance to flatten a small nation, the system spat out a contact profile matching a single destroyer. Just one ship. Within moments, Venezuelan patrol boats roared out of port at attack speed, vectoring hard toward what they genuinely believed was an isolated American warship operating alone in waters they wanted to dominate. This wasn't reconnaissance. This was a power play designed to force a U.S. vessel into backing down in international waters, where freedom of navigation isn't negotiable. It's guaranteed. Except Venezuela just committed the kind of tactical error that gets taught at war colleges as a cautionary tale. They thought they were squaring up against one destroyer. In reality, they were charging straight at the most lethal naval formation currently floating. They picked a fight with the wrong fleet. If you want to see how this high-stakes poker game played out move by move, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is a masterclass in naval intimidation without pulling a trigger. The first indication something was shifting didn't come from visual contact. It came from the tactical picture developing on American radar displays. Minutes after the Ford group settled into its southbound transit lane, 6 small surface contacts popped up on the northeastern sector of the screen. Initially, they looked completely benign. Typical coastal patrol traffic, boring, distant, forgettable. Then their behavior changed. Instead of maintaining the lazy, predictable patterns you'd expect from routine harbor security, these contacts tightened up. Their tracks curved inward, and operators monitoring the displays recognized what was forming: deliberate attack geometry. From a top-down view, the pattern snapped into a textbook arrowhead formation. One lead vessel held centerline. 2 pairs flanked outward at staggered intervals. All 6 were hammering along at 30 to 35 knots, throwing long white wakes, driving straight, aggressive, converging on a precise intercept point along the Ford's projected course. They weren't shadowing. They weren't observing from a safe distance. They were executing a deliberate intercept with zero ambiguity. Back at Venezuelan Coastal Command, the mistake was already locked in. That ancient JY-11B radar, known throughout the region for turning complex surface pictures into garbage past long range, had crushed the massive electromagnetic signature from an entire American carrier strike group into what appeared to be a single surface combatant. Believing they were only dealing with one ship instead of a full battle formation, local commanders launched 6 fast attack craft with the confidence that comes from operating on fatally flawed intelligence. Their objective was straightforward: pressure the destroyer, force a visible reaction, convert the encounter into a propaganda victory. On the bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford, outward composure remained absolute. Red combat lighting bathed the consoles. Watchstanders continued standard procedures, but underneath that calm, tactical awareness sharpened significantly. The symbols representing Venezuelan craft grew brighter as they crossed inside 20 nautical miles, one of the critical psychological thresholds for a vessel displacing 100,000 tons. Past this range, a supercarrier can't execute sharp turns or rapid acceleration to create meaningful separation. Every maneuver becomes slow, obvious, and potentially dangerous. Inside 15 nautical miles, the picture hardened into something unmistakable. The collision alarm remained silent, but the digital geometry told a different story. The patrol boats weren't steering around the strike group. They were driving directly into its path. Their angle was too precise, their spacing too deliberate, their bearing too exact. This wasn't navigational drift. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was textbook attack geometry. Escort destroyers sharpened their sensor focus, tracking each individual wake with increasing granularity, while U.S. radar operators fed continuous updates into the tactical plot. The Venezuelan formation maintained its arrowhead configuration, adjusting only by fractions to preserve the perfect intercept solution. Any hesitation, any widening of their track would have signaled caution, but the formation stayed rigid as a blade, which communicated only one thing. They were willing to escalate until the American formation flinched. Up on the Ford's flight deck, wind carried the low vibration of equipment being locked down. Deck crews secured tie-downs, checked cables, stowed loose gear. They moved calmly, professionally, but every action reflected tactical reality. 6 fast boats closing at night with coordinated spacing isn't a friendly visit. The danger isn't their tonnage, it's their velocity, their angles, their refusal to deviate. Out on the water, the gap compressed mile by mile. What started as faint radar returns now resembled a tightening vise aimed squarely at the Ford's bow. The geometry left the carrier strike group with exactly 2 options: maintain course with absolute conviction, or alter direction and transmit the worst possible signal. Hesitation in international waters, where the U.S. Navy categorically cannot afford to hesitate. So picture yourself on that bridge. 6 fast craft slicing toward your formation under darkness, holding perfect intercept geometry, daring you to be first to move. Do you hold course, or do you turn? The instant the Venezuelan formation crossed inside 15 nautical miles, the entire dynamic flipped. Up to that moment, the Ford strike group had been cruising with predictable rhythm, escorts floating in standard spacing around the carrier. But once those fast boats locked into a hard arrowhead and pushed past 35 knots, the American response transitioned instantly from passive monitoring to active control. The first countermove came from USS Thomas Hudner. Positioned on the Ford's forward quarter, the destroyer spooled up its turbines, adjusted its heading, and began sliding into a new trajectory. Smooth, cold, unmistakably deliberate. It cut across the Venezuelan intercept vector with the kind of precision you only see from a crew that knows exactly how this game gets played. This was a textbook soft block. No aggression, no provocation, yet absolutely firm. The message was unambiguous. The Hudner was claiming the geometry before the patrol boats could weaponize it. Out on open water, speed doesn't win confrontations, position does. A fast boat can outrun a destroyer, but it cannot outmaneuver one. By planting itself on the center line between the incoming formation and the carrier, the Hudner forced the Venezuelan boats into a narrow tactical corridor. Push through and reveal hostile intent, or turn away and watch your entire pressure operation collapse. Above this tightening geometry, air ripped with rotor wash as 2 MH-60R Seahawks lifted into the night. Their blades carved ripples across the flight deck before they climbed into Overwatch orbit, forming an illuminated perimeter around the carrier. From their vantage point, infrared sensors captured every detail of the Venezuelan boats: speed variations, bearing changes, wake patterns, even formation discipline. All of it streamed directly into the Combat Information Center. The helicopters weren't there to threaten. They were there to make one thing impossible to ignore. Nothing approaching the strike group would go undetected. But if the American posture radiated calm, Venezuela's approach was the opposite. The arrowhead tightened again, each fast boat micro-adjusted by fractions of a degree, preserving the exact angle required to pressure the Hudner's screen. The lead vessel pushed toward 40 knots, carving a razor-thin wake through black water. They didn't widen. They didn't drift. They didn't hesitate. From the destroyer's bridge, that refusal communicated everything. They weren't just flying the flag. They were executing a deliberate proximity-based challenge. Inside the Hudner, watch teams tracked the evolving geometry. Their soft block had secured control of the water, But it had also raised the stakes. By holding that position, the destroyer was announcing loudly and silently that the carrier's course was non-negotiable. The next move now belonged entirely to the Venezuelan boats. Tension deepened as the Seahawks transmitted sharper resolution. The Venezuelan formation held firm, rigid and fast, carving the sea with the determination of a force convinced it was chasing a single destroyer, not an entire carrier strike group. And that mistaken radar picture meant they were pressing far harder than they ever would have otherwise. Now, less than 10 nautical miles out, the boat still hadn't slowed. This was no longer about distance, it was about will. As Venezuelan fast boats continued pressing toward the strike group, the atmosphere inside the American formation shifted from quiet geometry management to a sharper form of readiness, the kind that doesn't escalate the moment, but makes it crystal clear that escalation is available. USS Thomas Hudner remained locked in its soft block position, yet the narrowing distance created tension demanding something more visible than maneuvering alone. That signal came from the Mark 45 gun. The turret didn't snap or swivel aggressively. Instead, it rotated in a slow, deliberate arc that settled just a few degrees toward the incoming wakes. Movement subtle enough to avoid provocation, yet obvious enough for any trained observer to understand. It wasn't a warning shot, but it was a message, and in naval confrontations, that message often carries more weight than the round itself. Moments later, the Phalanx CIWS shifted from dormancy into passive tracking. Its white dome didn't whirl frantically. It made short, economical sweeps that fed a constant stream of high-definition data into the Hudner's combat system. To anyone watching from the fast boats, the weapon appeared calm, almost idle, though every rotation meant the destroyer could respond in seconds if the encounter crossed the line. Above the formation, the two MH-60R Seahawks tightened their orbit, infrared pods cutting through dark water like spotlights that never blinked. They weren't circling to intimidate. They were establishing a perimeter of awareness, making it clear that nothing approaching the carrier would go unseen or unrecorded, regardless of size or speed. Meanwhile, SPY-6 radar shifted into its low-emission listening stance, the mode the Navy uses when it wants precision without the aggressive signature of full broadcast. It read Venezuelan wakes, engine surges, and bearing shifts with almost clinical clarity, building a three-dimensional picture of vessels showing zero sign of slowing or widening their formation. By then, geometry had tightened into a high-pressure cone, and the lead Venezuelan craft surged forward with a burst of acceleration that told its own story. The wake sharpened, the bow rose, water beneath it fractured into spray, small signs to the eye, but enormous signals on sensors. At roughly 1,000 yards, the decisive moment arrived. A fire control radar pulse lit up the Hudner's forward section, not long enough to trigger alarms, but unmistakable to anyone who's ever worked a naval watch. It was the technical equivalent of placing a finger on a trigger without pulling it, non-lethal, but dangerously intimate. And yet, even with that unmistakable lock, American posture didn't change. The gun stayed angled, not aimed. CIWS stayed passive, not aggressive. Seahawks stayed overhead, steady and disciplined. And the carrier continued on its original heading, unmoved by pressure from smaller, faster craft. What unfolded in those moments wasn't intimidation and wasn't fear. It was control. Precise, measured, absolute. Every weapon, every sensor, every orbit and bearing aligned to a single purpose: prevent escalation without provoking it. Even as Venezuelan boats refused to break momentum, and still they kept coming. As distance between the two formations continued shrinking, the confrontation moved off the surface of the water and into the radio spectrum, where communication becomes its own weapon and silence can carry more weight than any shouted warning. When Venezuelan fast boats crossed inside the 5 nautical mile band, the U.S. strike group triggered the next phase of its posture, broadcasting a formal freedom of navigation message across the international hailing channel. A calm, precise declaration that the American formation was operating lawfully in international waters, following a designated corridor, and had zero intention of altering course or speed. It was standard protocol in moments like this, yet its timing gave it gravity, because the message not only established a clean legal record for any future diplomatic review, but also placed responsibility for avoiding escalation squarely on the Venezuelan craft. And then came the part that told U.S. commanders more than any transmission could have. The channel remained empty. No acknowledgement, no challenge, no explanation, just silence. Dense, intentional, unmistakably deliberate. Silence at sea rarely means indecision. More often, it signals resolve. Venezuelan boats held their arrowhead geometry without a hint of hesitation, their wakes slicing straight lines through dark water as if the broadcast had never existed. And that refusal to answer communicated more about their intent than any radio message ever could. They weren't seeking clarification. They weren't requesting space. They were pushing the moment further into a zone where miscalculation becomes as dangerous as malice. For the U.S. Navy, implications extended far beyond this narrow stretch of water, because a carrier strike group represents national authority, and any course deviation under pressure, even a turn of a single degree, could later be portrayed as a concession. That's why the Ford Group held its heading with absolute precision, understanding that posture, not volume, defines resolve at sea, and that a steady course carries more political weight than any shouted instruction over an open frequency. Meanwhile, combat information centers aboard the escorts focused less on the empty radio channel and more on cold data flowing through acoustic sensors and electronic analysis suites. Those readings revealed engine signatures staying firmly above 20 knots, occasionally spiking as Venezuelan boats tightened their formation. The pattern made it painfully clear that craft were maintaining combat-ready speed and showed no signs of drifting, slowing, or reconsidering their approach. Each minute thickened the atmosphere. The Caribbean stayed deceptively calm on the surface, but beneath that calm lived a layered standoff, tactical in the water, analytical in the sensors, psychological on the radio waves, where both sides knew even the smallest deviation could tilt the entire encounter. And through it all, the U.S. formation held its geometry with discipline that felt almost ceremonial. No ship adjusted course, no aircraft changed altitude, no additional broadcasts were sent. By the time the Venezuelan formation pushed deeper into the inner band, one reality had taken shape with absolute clarity. This encounter was no longer driven by radar misreads or navigational error. It had evolved into a pure contest of will, fought in silence across open water, with every mile closing the gap between intention and consequence. As Venezuelan patrol boats pushed deeper into the inner band, encounter geometry locked into its most dangerous configuration, both formations appearing on radar and infrared feeds like two parallel walls of steel advancing toward the same sliver of water, neither side willing to yield a single inch. The Ford strike group held its steady 20-knot march, remaining exactly on the heading declared in its earlier broadcast, while the Venezuelan arrowhead, still compressed and tense, maintained speeds in the high 20s, as if momentum alone might shift the balance of the night. Tension truly sharpened when range collapsed into what sailors refer to as the gray zone, a space so tight that reactions must be instantaneous, yet so unforgiving that even a small miscalculation can trigger consequences no commander intends. At roughly 1,000 yards, every margin disappears. Ships can no longer shift course without signaling weakness, and fast boats cannot alter direction without revealing their intentions. Every wake, engine pitch, micro-drift becomes part of a silent negotiation where the smallest movement carries outsized meaning. Even inside that volatile band, the U.S. formation held itself still, with a level of discipline that felt almost defiant. There were no course corrections, no extra radio calls, no power changes, only the Thomas Hudner remaining welded to its blocking position, shielding the carrier while keeping weapons in passive tracking. Through that stillness, the Americans projected something stronger than force, the confidence to hold a line even when distance had collapsed into seconds rather than minutes. Inside combat information centers, analysts watched as data painted an increasingly vivid picture of the Venezuelan state of mind. Their engines stayed at high thrust. Their wakes remained tight and narrow. Their bearing lines showed no drift, yet subtle cracks began appearing inside the once rigid arrowhead. Bow angles wavered by fractions of a degree, almost invisible to the human eye, yet unmistakable to Seahawk sensors orbiting overhead, and boats' wakes widened just enough to betray growing hesitation inside a formation that until then had held its geometry like a spear point. On American ships, atmosphere grew even more focused. Sailors kept moving through routines with controlled efficiency, fully aware they stood in the space where misjudgment and escalation can become indistinguishable. Operators monitored their scopes for any sign that Venezuelan boats might either force a breakthrough attempt or peel away in retreat, because both outcomes were now equally possible. Then, with no warning except numbers on the consoles, the moment of decision became visible. Speed signatures of Venezuelan boats, solidly above 30 knots for most of the approach, began to fall, first to the mid-20s, then low 20s, finally settling near 18 knots. From above, Seahawks recorded the transition with clinical clarity. Wakes shortened, bow waves diminished, and the once compressed formation began relaxing outward. It was not tactical maneuvering, it was a force stepping back from the edge. And in perfect contrast, the U.S. formation did nothing. The Hudner held its screen. The carrier maintained speed. Radios stayed silent. Every ship remained locked on its original heading, preserving the same geometry that had defined the standoff from the beginning. Venezuelan patrol craft had driven themselves to the brink, but the gray zone, unforgiving and unavoidable, forced the decision they'd hoped to avoid. When the moment finally broke, the truth was unmistakable. Venezuela blinked. Washington didn't. As Venezuelan patrol boats bled down to roughly 18 knots, the once sharp arrowhead they'd carried across the water finally began collapsing. Rigid angles softening into wider arcs that drifted outward as if the formation itself had lost the will to hold its blade-like posture. From the air, Seahawks captured every subtle movement, each boat turning only a few degrees toward the coastline, slow enough to mimic routine patrolling, yet precise enough to reveal a deliberate step back from the confrontation they'd pushed to the edge. The American formation, in stark contrast, didn't shift so much as a fraction of a degree. USS Gerald R held its 20-knot advance as if nothing had happened at all, and USS Thomas Hudner remained welded to the front of the screen, projecting control through stillness so absolute it carried more authority than any radio transmission could have offered. Inside combat centers, operators watched Venezuelan spacing widen, tight geometry unraveling, until the pattern resembled ordinary coastal movement rather than an intercept meant to pressure a U.S. warship in international waters. No American voice broke radio silence. No acknowledgement was issued. No change in formation signaled relief. The U.S. strategy from the beginning had been built on discipline, and that same discipline defined the end. The geometry alone told the story, and the geometry now showed only one thing: the standoff was finished. Above them, Seahawks continued their unbroken orbit, documenting the retreat with the same calm precision they'd used to record the advance, while SPY-6 and shipboard sensors tracked the withdrawing wakes to ensure the pullback was real, steady, and not a feint, hiding a sudden attempt to sprint back into the gray zone. By the time patrol boats settled onto a heading pointed directly toward Venezuelan waters, the confrontation had fully dissolved. No collision, no warning shots, not even a raised voice over the radio spectrum. The American formation continued exactly as it had before the intercept ever began, untouched and unaltered, while a quieter question lingered among those watching from the bridge and flight deck. If a single radar misread had driven Venezuelan boats this far into danger tonight, how far might the next misunderstanding push them? And what happens when the margin for error is even smaller? In the end, this clash in the Caribbean came to a close without a single round fired. Even though Venezuelan patrol craft tried blocking the path of a U.S. carrier, locked fire control radar onto an American destroyer, and drove themselves deep into the gray zone where mistakes turn into headlines. Through it all, the Ford Strike Group never shifted a degree off course. Its weapons turned silently, its sensors stayed focused, and its discipline carried the weight that missiles never needed to deliver. The only vessels that bent were the fast boats themselves, slowing first, widening their spacing next, finally slipping back toward home waters, while the carrier group continued exactly where it had intended to go from the start. This encounter revealed something raw firepower alone can't demonstrate: that American strength at sea lives in presence, composure, and the ability to manage danger without letting it dictate the outcome. And if you imagine yourself standing on that bridge, watching 6 fast boats carve toward your formation in the dark, you have to ask, would you have held the line the way the US Navy did? If this standoff kept you on edge, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next silent encounter on open water may shape the future of global shipping lanes, and you won't want to miss how it unfolds. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. See you next time.